False information around health can be particularly dangerous and sometimes deadly. Rumors and miracle cures have accompanied all of humanity's health crises, from the Black Death in the late Middle Ages to the Spanish flu and AIDS in the 20th century to Ebola and COVID-19 crises in the 21st. People desperate to avoid disease or get well will grasp at potential safeguards or remedies. Harmful health misinformation can fool anyone, however educated they might be. The coronavirus pandemic highlighted these dangers like never before. As COVID-19 spread around the globe, it was accompanied by a wave of false cures and advice. From the myth that drinking hot liquids would neutralize the virus to the hoax that drinking alcohol would stave it off. The latter led to hundreds of people dying from alcohol poisoning in Iran. In this video, we'll teach you the basic tools and techniques for fact-checking claims around health and the environment. We'll cover reputable sources for trusted information and also peer and preprint reviews. We'll look at the concept of correlation versus cause and effect and give you some tips on how to read scientific studies. Finally, we'll give you a list of sources to get you started. Let's start with reputable sources. Facing a tsunami of false information can be overwhelming, particularly when anyone can easily build a sophisticated website. How do you know which sources to trust? How can you tell a charlatan from a genuine expert? There are thousands of scientific journals. Reporters focused on health and science mostly rely on a few dozen. 4 of the most respected and frequently cited are the New England Journal of Medicine, the BMJ, which was formerly the British Medical Journal, Nature Medicine, and The Lancet, which has numerous specialized health journals. If you come across a study from an unknown publication, you need to check to make sure it's recognized by the scientific community. First, check if it's a subsidiary of one of the reputable publications on our list of resources. If not, check to see if it's an in-house publication of a national science or medical association, for example, the National Cancer Institute in the US. If you're consulting a government publication, you need to be aware of the current political context and cross-check with other sources. Be aware that there are lots of suspect journals and even some fraudulent ones, including predatory journals that only exist to make a buck from scientists desperate to get into print. Make sure to check whether anyone has flagged the publication you're looking at as predatory. If you're still stuck, you can always ask fellow health journalists and fact-checkers whether a publication is reputable or not. Chances are someone has come across it already. Keep in mind that not everything in a reputable publication is a study. They also publish opinion pieces and commentary articles, which may or may not be peer-reviewed. For example, several misleading claims about COVID-19 and the flu in August 2020 cited their source as the British Medical Journal, sharing a link to the material. But the link was not to a scientific study, but rather to a comment on an article about the COVID-19 pandemic. In a peer review, a journal contacts independent experts from the same scientific field to evaluate a study for its methodology and results. In other words, competent people make sure that it was carried out correctly and that the results say and mean what the authors claim. Peer reviewing is generally considered the gold standard for scientific studies. Then there are preprints. These are studies that have not yet gone through a peer review process. You need to treat the findings of these studies with extra caution, as their methods and results have not yet been independently analyzed. In the case of COVID-19, many studies have been released in preprints. That is because the peer review process can take weeks or months. In a major worldwide pandemic, there's a strong demand to see developments sooner. This has served the public interest, since the more information is made available, the higher the chances that researchers will make progress. But it can also open the door to the spread of mis- and disinformation, as the research lacks customary rigor. Cause and effect is when one factor impacts another, but proving a cause and effect relationship is difficult. In clinical trials, you create an experiment in which 2 groups are exposed to identical conditions, except for one. This allows you to isolate and measure the impact of that one factor. For example, 2 groups of people with the same baseline profile, age, general health, drug and alcohol consumption, take part in an experiment. They weigh the same and do the same amount of exercise each day. They're given the same amount of food, except that one group gets ice cream each evening. If at the end of the experiment the ice cream group gains weight, it's fairly safe to say that ice cream causes weight gain, or that ice cream is the cause of the weight gain. Clinical trials considered among the most solid are randomized controlled trials. In these, one group of volunteers is given a treatment and another is given a placebo. But you can't test everything that way. For example, you can't give people a harmful substance to prove that it causes cancer. So there's another type of study called observational. These studies look at different data and are based on correlations and associations. They will try to see if something could be a factor in causing cancer, for example. But correlations can be tricky. Since one factor isn't isolated, as it is in a clinical trial, you can't say for certain which factor is causing an effect. If 99% of people who die from cancer eat cucumbers, does that mean that cucumbers cause cancer? Or take alcohol. It is one thing to establish that people who drink 1 dose of alcohol per day live longer than heavy drinkers, which is not surprising, as well as longer than those who don't drink at all, which is surprising. It is another thing to speculate as to why. Scientists have looked for an impact of drinking alcohol to explain this conclusion, based on data from hundreds of thousands of people. For a long time, it was thought that stress relief played a big part. But recently, some researchers suggested another possibility. Perhaps it's not alcohol that's causing the longevity. Perhaps alcohol is a sign of something else that's causing it. For example, someone with the discipline to have only 1 drink a day is someone who probably lives in moderation across the board. So they're less likely to smoke, to eat too much bad food, or to avoid exercise. So do we know for sure why people who drink 1 dose of alcohol a day live longer than both heavy drinkers and people who don't drink at all? No, we don't. We have a few good correlational clues, but we don't have a direct cause and effect. Some things to keep in mind: even the best studies always call on others to confirm their conclusions. Sometimes they just lay out a hypothesis. Sometimes the results confirm or void other studies. That's why a fact checker should avoid writing that a study proves something. In the science world, you need many studies to say the same thing before you can have a consensus on a particular issue or topic. So it's better to use a more neutral term, like a study shows something. You also need to master how to read studies. For a non-specialist, this can be daunting. First, start with the abstract, which condenses a study. There's also the introduction, which will provide useful context and background. Most articles will also have a discussion section at the end, a bit like the introduction, but often with a forward-looking element that addresses the implications of the findings. Some US journals have now started to require a plain English version of the abstract, which is very helpful. All these will give you a good idea of what the study actually says. This is important because often claims attribute things to studies that aren't actually in the studies. To get you started, here's a list we've put together of reputable publications. Don't be shy to contact authors of studies themselves. Most scientists will be keen to make sure that they're being correctly understood. When contacting experts, it's best to choose a specialist. You will often come across claims citing doctors or researchers. Always do a search on this person. Are they reputable in their field? Are they an expert in a specific field or topic? And did they actually say what is being attributed to them? During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw several cases of Nobel laureates being attributed something they did not say. Also, remember that science is always evolving. What served as scientific consensus at one point can be questioned, put under scrutiny, and eventually overturned. And there are plenty of questions to which there are no answers. Let's go through a few fact checks to show you how the techniques that we've described above apply in practice. This claim said that children vaccinated against the flu are more vulnerable to coronavirus infections. The debunk allowed us to explain how a scientific journal's brand was misused and to show the importance of sample size in a study, as well as the prevalence of websites that regularly publish false information. We first set the context. Several of the misleading posts claimed that the evidence came from the British Medical Journal and shared a link to the material. The link was not to a scientific study, but to a comment to an article about the COVID-19 pandemic. Other claims put the source as an article on a website that has hosted false information in the past. We then explained about studies and how they worked. The false claim did have its origins in a study. However, that study had flaws in its methodology. It only included 115 children over one flu season, and it had 1.5 times more children in one group than in the other. We also found and cited 2 other studies, which included thousands of people over multiple flu seasons and which refuted the results of the flawed study. We then contacted government health authorities in both the US and Canada for the latest recommendations on flu shots. Now let's take a look at another claim, which falsely said that 5G technology creates coronavirus in human cells. The debunk allowed us to once again show the importance of knowing which studies to trust, and that the peer review process is not foolproof. In July 2020, media posts and blog articles claimed that the National Institutes of Health admitted that 5G technology can create coronavirus within human cells. The NIH is part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, serving as a medical research agency in the U.S. It is generally considered a credible source of information. The claims relied on a study that appeared in a scientific publisher, BioLife, and was later added to a catalog of a website, PubMed.gov, which is part of the NIH. Normally, a study appearing within the NIH system would be considered credible. This particular one was later retracted from both websites, so we decided to see why. This would make our debunk much stronger. As we looked into the details of the study, we found several warning signs. For one, the study was labeled both as peer-reviewed and as editorial on its front page. A work can be one or the other, but it can't be both. We dug deeper, talking to scientists who told us that the journal that published the work was predatory in nature and was not transparent about either its submission practices or its payment for works published. We contacted a specialist in physics to ask him about the study's claim that 5G millimeter waves could be absorbed by dermatological cells that would then produce coronaviruses. The specialist told us that the premise didn't hold up from a physics point of view, since millimeter waves were fairly similar in 5G and 4G. He also said that the equations cited in the study did not make any sense. We got confirmation for his opinion from both the World Health Organization and from a specialist in scientific malpractice, who also happened to have written a full analysis of the paper. She pointed out other problems that would normally set off alarm bells. For one, the paper confused COVID-19, the disease, with the virus that causes it. That's like confusing HIV with AIDS. While laypeople could make such a mistake, serious scientists would not. We tried to look into the validation process that the study went through before being published, but unfortunately couldn't get very far because the editor-in-chief of BioLife refused to elaborate on the process or to say why it was subsequently retracted. We got a little further with PubMed.gov, which explained to us how the study ended up appearing on the website. The journal that published the study was indexed in a bibliographic database. This debunk was a good reminder that iffy publications can make their way into normally reliable databases. Having a firm grasp of basic concepts like peer review will help you spot them. Contacting the right experts will help illuminate any inconsistencies or errors. Often, the role of a fact-checker stops where that of a scientific researcher begins. The field is always evolving and there are no absolutes, but you now have the basic tools and techniques to set you on your way.